Imagine armor so hot it brands your flesh while you're still wearing it. May 18th, 1190. 10,000 men who'd been eating dead horses and drinking poisoned water were about to commit tactical suicide. They'd face 40,000 fresh Turkish warriors and assault a fortified city simultaneously. The mathematics screamed impossible. Every military doctrine said they'd be slaughtered like cattle. Yet in 6 hours of mechanized butchery, they'd kill 20,000 enemies and break an empire. This is the story of how a 68-year-old emperor named Frederick Barbarossa, the Red Beard, proved that sometimes genius matters more than numbers, and that heavy cavalry charging downhill can turn men into red paste faster than arrows can fly. But here's what makes this battle truly insane. Barbarossa deliberately split his already outnumbered force in half. 3,000 men under his son would assault walls that had never fallen. 7,000 under Barbarossa himself would face an army 6 times their size on open ground. Military academies would call this suicide. Barbarossa called it Tuesday. How could exhausted men who'd lost 90,000 comrades defeat 40,000 fresh warriors? Why would a commander divide an inferior force? What made Turkish cavalry archers, undefeated for decades, panic and flee from starving Germans? The answers lie in 6 hours, where the Anatolian plain became a slaughterhouse, and where courage mixed with desperation created the most complete tactical victory in Crusader history. 3 weeks earlier, 100,000 crusaders had entered Anatolia, following the Redbeard into hell itself. Now, 15,000 remained. Disease killed more than arrows. Dysentery turned men into walking skeletons who shit blood and died clutching their guts. Heat exhaustion dropped knights in full armor, 250 pounds of steel that cooked them alive when temperatures hit 95 degrees Fahrenheit. They'd started drinking from poisoned wells after the Turks contaminated every water source. Men vomited black bile and died with lips cracked open like dried leather. Horses collapsed by hundreds, and then became food for soldiers who'd eaten their own boot leather weeks ago. Sultan Kilij Arslan II watched and smiled. His strategy was perfect. Let the sun and starvation kill the crusaders without risking his warriors. The Seljuk Sultanate controlled Anatolia from their capital at Iconium, modern Konya. Triple walls, 30 feet high. Garrison of 5,000, and it had never fallen to assault. Behind those walls sat supplies for months. Fresh water, and the strategic position controlling the only viable pass to Syria and the Holy Land. Taking Iconium meant breaking Turkish power forever. Failing meant the crusade died in Anatolia. Bodies rotting under that merciless sun. But Frederick Barbarossa had spent 40 years learning how men break in battle. At 68, when most men prepared for death, he was about to teach the Turkish Empire why Europe's enemies still woke, screaming from nightmares about German steel. May 17, Barbarossa counted his remaining forces with the cold calculation of a butcher weighing meat. 10,000 men remained combat effective. Though effective, was generous for soldiers who could barely stand. 2,000 knights still had war horses. Though the animals were skeletal nightmares that looked like they'd walked out of hell itself. 8,000 infantry gripped weapons with hands that shook from starvation and fear. These weren't the cream of European chivalry anymore. They were the survivors. The hardest, meanest, most determined killers who'd watched 90,000 comrades die and decided they'd rather murder Turks than join them in mass graves. Duke Frederick VI of Swabia, Barbarossa's 23-year-old son, commanded the vanguard. Count Robert of Nassau led Rhineland veterans. Markward of Neuburg commanded the Imperial Guard, 500 men who'd sworn to die before letting harm reach the emperor. Against them, 5,000 garrison troops behind walls that had never fallen, 40,000 more approaching under Sultan Kilij Arslan himself, 20,000 elite cavalry archers who could fire 12 aimed shots per minute while galloping at full speed, 15,000 infantry, 5,000 irregulars, hungry for Christian gold and blood. The temperature would reach 95 degrees. Fighting in full armor under that sun seemed like assisted suicide. Turkish commanders actually laughed when scouts reported crusader positions. What could 10,000 exhausted corpses walking do against overwhelming force and impregnable walls? They were about to find out what happens when you corner desperate men who've got nothing left to lose except their lives. Evening of May 17th, Barbarossa did something that made his own commanders think he'd gone insane. He split his inferior force. Duke Frederick would take 3,000 men and assault Iconium directly. Barbarossa would position 7,000 to meet the Sultan's approaching army. Each force was now outnumbered 5-1 or worse. Military doctrine screamed this was suicide. Dividing inferior forces invited destruction in detail. His commanders protested loudly. Duke Frederick argued for concentration. Count Robert suggested retreat or negotiation. But Barbarossa had learned something in 4 decades of turning battlefields into abattoirs. Sometimes audacity succeeds where prudence gets you killed. His plan was elegant madness. The garrison, seeing only 3,000 crusaders, would sally out for easy slaughter. Meanwhile, Barbarossa would position his 7,000 to receive the Sultan's 40,000. Both forces should be annihilated by every mathematical calculation. But mathematics doesn't account for the concentrated impact force of 2,000 heavy cavalry charging downhill into enemies who've never faced it before. Turkish psychological warfare began immediately. Riders circled beyond crossbow range, shouting taunts in broken German. They displayed captured crusader banners soaked in blood. They described in graphic detail exactly how Christian warriors would be skinned alive, castrated, and fed to dogs. Some crusaders wavered. Morale already shattered by 3 weeks of hell threatened to crack completely. Then Barbarossa himself appeared among the men. At 68, he still cut a figure that made young warriors feel inadequate. His presence, calm, confident, almost amused by Turkish threats, steadied nerves ready to snap. Tomorrow, he said simply, we remind them why their grandfathers feared us. Dawn, May 18th, 1190. 2 crusader columns separated in pre-dawn darkness, executing Barbarossa's seemingly suicidal plan while Turkish scouts watched in disbelief. Duke Frederick led his 3,000 directly toward Iconium's massive gates. The smaller force moved openly, making no attempt at concealment. Were the Christians actually committing suicide? Barbarossa positioned his 7,000 on a slight rise 2 miles from the city. His deployment looked desperate. Cavalry on the wings, infantry in center, spread thin. To Turkish observers trained in warfare, it looked like exhausted men preparing for their last pathetic stand. The Sultan's scouts reported exactly what Barbarossa wanted them to see. First arrows came at sunrise. Turkish cavalry archers swept forward in their traditional crescent formation, confident this would be another easy harassment. The sky turned black with 10,000 shafts, wrote a surviving chronicler who'd watched similar attacks for 3 weeks. But something was different. The crusaders weren't panicking or retreating. They raised shields in practiced unison, creating overlapping protection that arrows couldn't penetrate. Losses were minimal. This wasn't the reaction Turks expected from beaten enemies. Duke Frederick reached Iconium's walls by mid-morning. The garrison commander faced a dilemma that would cost him everything. These 3,000 crusaders posed no real threat to 30-foot walls. But leaving them unmolested invited siege preparations. Pride and overconfidence made his decision. Why cower behind impregnable walls when Turkish cavalry could ride down exhausted Christians? The gates opened, massive wooden doors that groaned on iron hinges. 2,000 garrison cavalry poured out like a steel flood. Confident they were riding to easy slaughter and glory, they had no idea they were riding to their deaths.